Welcome to THE Last ETRNT channel. So you don't miss more videos like this one, subscribe now. In a mill town along the Androskagan River in western Maine, on the morning of October 14th, 1887, a 19-year-old weaver named Abigail Morse was pulled from the shallows just below the dam, her left shoe missing and her hair tangled with river weed. Over the next 11 months, from 3 different corners of that town, 3 different men would be arrested for her killing, tried in the same small courthouse, and walk out free. Not one of them confessed. Not one of them was convicted, and without ever saying so out loud, the town itself seemed to have agreed by the summer of 1888 that her name was never to be spoken again. What happened in those 11 months? And why every thread of the case, unraveled in the hands of the men investigating it, was never written into any official history of the state of Maine. But the record survives. It survives in a handful of yellowed letters, the payroll ledgers of a shuttered mill, a surveyor's private diary, and the loose pages of a coroner who resigned 2 days before Christmas and left town on the first train that would take him. Before we continue with the story of Abigail Morse, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you are new here so you do not miss our next investigation, and leave a comment below telling us which state or city you are listening from tonight. More than you know, your presence matters because stories like this one survive only as long as someone is willing to listen. And to understand how 3 men could be accused of the same killing, and all 3 could be set free, you first have to understand the town itself. Because in this story, the town is the 4th suspect, and in many ways the most dangerous one. The town was called Piton Falls, and by New England standards in 1887 it was not old. It had been stitched together in the 1840s around a set of cotton mills built where the Androskagan narrowed and dropped, and it had grown the way mill towns grew in that century, in fast, crook bursts, swallowing farms and pine forest and pulling in whatever cheap labor the railroads could deliver. By the time Abigail Morse was born there, in 1868, close to 4,000 residents called Piton Falls home. 2 large mills, a canal, a company store, 3 churches, 4 saloons, and a population that was split with almost no crossing. Now, between old Yankee families who had owned the land before the mills, and 3 waves of newcomers the mills had brought in, there were the Irish, who had arrived first during the hungry years and who now held most of the skilled positions on the looms. And in the machine shops, there were the French Canadians who had come south from Quebec in the 70s and 80s. Whole families at a time, often speaking no English, taking the lowest paid work in the weaving rooms. And as overseers and engineers, a smaller number of Scots and Cornish were brought in because the owners trusted them not to mix with the rank and file. The 4,000 people of Piton Falls lived in the same town, walked the same muddy streets, and drank from the same river, but they did not marry each other, did not worship in the same buildings, and did not, as a rule, tell each other's secrets. The town had a particular sound, one that anyone who lived there would carry in their body for the rest of their life. It was the sound of the falls themselves, a low, continuous roar that came up from the river day and night, and layered over that was the sound of the mills, a deeper, slower thrumming that started at 5 in the morning with the first whistle, and did not stop until 9 at night. On Sundays, the mills were silent, and the falls were all you heard. And the old people said you could feel the difference in your chest, the absence of a weight you had not known you were carrying. When you stepped inside them, the weaving rooms themselves were a different climate altogether. Hot and humid in summer to keep the threads from breaking, kept damp in winter by steam pipes that hissed along the ceiling, and loud in a way that made speech almost impossible so that over the decades the women who worked there had developed a whole language of gesture and lip reading and shouted single words that conveyed the commands and warnings and private jokes of a 12-hour shift. You could always tell a weaver on the street by the way she leaned slightly forward when spoken to, and by the way she answered you, when she answered at all, with her mouth formed more carefully than other people's mouths, as though every word had been shaped for someone who could not quite hear. The mill itself sat at the center of everything. It was owned by a man named Silas Brigham, who had inherited it from his father, and who lived in a tall white house on a hill above the dam where the water noise never stopped. In 1887, Silas Brigham was 61 years old, a widower, a deacon in the Congregational Church, and the single largest employer for 40 miles in any direction. He was also, as nearly every sworn statement in the later investigations would note without quite saying it, a man accustomed to being obeyed. He had large, pale hands that he kept folded when he was listening, and he listened a great deal, and when he spoke softly, so that people leaned in to hear him, which was, those who dealt with him often said later, part of how he worked. In any ordinary sense, he was not a cruel man. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike his servants. Out of his own pocket, he gave generously to the church and paid for the annual orphans' Christmas dinner. He was, in the phrase used by his pastor in the eulogy delivered 16 years later, a pillar. But pillars, as anyone who has stood beneath one in an old building knows, bear a great weight. And the weight presses downward, and what is beneath them is often the thing that is never questioned. His son, Ezra Brigham, was 24, unmarried, home from 2 years at a business college in Boston, and within the decade widely expected to take over the mill. Ezra was taller than his father, better dressed than his father, and possessed of a laugh that people in Peaton Falls on weekend evenings heard often in the saloons along the canal. Although he was never drunk, or never quite drunk, because Ezra Brigham knew precisely where the line was. Among the girls in the weaving rooms he had a reputation, and that reputation was not a kind one. There were stories, of course, passed in whispers in the boarding houses and over kitchen tables in French and Irish and Yankee English about girls who had been cornered in stairwells, about girls who had been offered rides home in the Brigham carriage and had accepted, and had not spoken of the ride afterward, about a girl 2 years before who had left the town abruptly to live with an aunt in Rutland, Vermont, and had returned 10 months later, thinner and quieter, and with a look in her eyes that the women in the weaving rooms recognized without needing to name. But the reputation stayed inside the weaving rooms. It did not climb the hill to the White House. Before that October morning, it did not find its way into print anywhere in the state of Maine. On the second floor of the South Mill, in the number 2 weaving room, Abigail Morse worked. She had been there since she was 13, as her mother had been before her, and her older sister, Mercy, still was. The Morse family were Yankees, not Irish and not French, which in Peaton Falls mattered in ways that were never spoken of directly, but organized every aspect of daily life. It meant on the edge of town they had a small clapboarded house of their own, rather than a room in a boarding house on the canal. It meant through the 6th grade Abigail had gone to the district school and could read the Bible and write a clean hand, which she did in 3 surviving letters to a cousin in Luan. It meant when she was killed that there were people willing to ask questions, at least at first. Abigail's father had died in a logging accident when she was 11, crushed beneath a log that had rolled off a sled on a steep hillside above the river. And her mother, a quiet woman named Hannah, kept the family alive on the wages of her 2 daughters and a little piecework sewing she took in at night. There was no money for doctors, no money for a lawyer, no money for the kind of pressure that could hold a rich man's feet to a fire. There was only, as Hannah Morse would write later in a letter that never reached its address, a mother's memory of a daughter who had been, in her mother's words, bright and watchful and too pretty for her own safety in that town. Abigail was, by the accounts of the three women who worked the looms beside her, a serious girl. She was not flirtatious. She did not go to the dance halls on the canal. In a tin box under her bed she saved her wages, a box her mother would open 3 days after her funeral and find to contain 43.11, a sum that had been nearly 2 years in the accumulation, and that had been meant, though Hannah Morse did not know it yet, for a specific purpose. In the autumn of 1887, Abigail was engaged to be married quietly to a young man named Michael Thibodeau, a French-Canadian machinist 2 years older than her, who had saved enough to rent 2 rooms above a cooper shop, and who was by every account steady and gentle and devoted to her. The engagement was not announced. Her mother approved of Michael Thibodeau, but the wider Morse family did not, because he was a Catholic and French, and not their kind, and Abigail had learned at 19 that some things were easier to do than to explain. And they were going to marry in the spring after the roads dried, and they were going to move to Leuven, where a position at a larger mill had been offered to Michael, and where no one would look sideways at a Yankee girl on the arm of a French boy. They had a plan. They had a future. The 43 in the tin box was the down payment on a small house on the outskirts of Leuven, a house Michael had already walked past 4 times and described to her in letters that Abigail had read by candlelight in the small room she shared with her sister. On the afternoon of October 13, 1887, Abigail finished her shift at the number 2 weaving room at 7 minutes past 6, punched her card, said goodnight to her sister, Mercy, and walked out into the dusk with a shawl over her hair and a tin lunch pail in her hand. Mercy Morse, who would survive her sister by 44 years, and would speak of that evening only twice in all the years that followed, once to a neighbor in 1900 and once to a priest in 1930, remembered that Abigail had seemed tired, but not unusually so, had asked her to tell their mother that she would be home by 8, and had walked out by the canal gate rather than the main gate, which was slightly unusual, though Abigail sometimes did this when she wanted to stop at the small dry goods store on Water Street to buy thread or ribbon. It was the last time Mercy saw her sister standing. She was never seen alive again by anyone who would later admit to seeing her. In October, the Androskagan River is cold. From the lakes the water comes down already dark, and by mid-month the nights drop below freezing, and a skim of ice forms along the quiet shallows by morning. On the 14th of October, the sun rose at 60:06, and at 60:30 a boy named Cyrus Fournier, 12 years old, walking his father's 2 milk cows down to the river to drink before the first bell, saw a shape at the edge of the water, just below the dam, where the current curled back on itself and made a slow pool behind the old grinding stones. The shape was long and pale and did not move. For the rest of his life the boy would remember the particular way the morning light had looked on the water, a flat gray light with a little pink in it, where the sun was coming up over the pines on the east bank, and the way his breath had come out in a cloud that hung for a second before drifting sideways once, and the way the cows had stopped a few yards short of the shape and had lowed, not loudly, but in a sound he had never heard a cow make before, a sound that had made the hair stand up on his arms before he understood what he was looking at. Cyrus Fournier dropped his switch and ran. Past the cows he ran, past his own house, past the cooper's shop where Michael Thibodeau had just lit the stove, and he did not stop running until he reached the constable's house on Elm Street, where he pounded on the door with both fists and told the constable's wife in a mixture of English and French that there was a dead girl in the river. The constable was a man named Horace Pellier, a French-Canadian who had been on the town payroll for 9 years and who was by the common judgment of Piton Falls a decent and not especially clever man. A slow way of speaking he had, and a slower way of thinking. And both had in 9 years of minor peacekeeping in a company town served him perfectly well, because the problems he was ever called on to solve were problems that had already been settled by someone else before he arrived. At 7:15, he arrived at the river with 2 deputies and a doctor named Ephraim Haw. Dr. Haw was also the town coroner, a position he held by vote of the selectmen, and for which he was paid $12 a year. He was 57 years old, a widower for 6 years, with 1 grown son who had gone to divinity school in Bangor. He had a small practice that supplemented the coroner's fee, and he owed as of October 14, 1887, a debt of $420 to the Bridgam Mill Company, a debt incurred by his late brother 3 years before, and for which Dr. Haw, as the only surviving family member of means, was legally responsible. The debt was not yet overdue. For another 11 months it would not come due. This fact is important, and we will return to it. In 3 separate documents, what the 4 men saw when they pulled Abigail Morse from the shallows was recorded in different forms, and the 3 documents would not agree. The constable's log said simply that the deceased had been found face down in 2 feet of water, fully clothed except for her left shoe, with no visible injuries other than a bruise on the left temple consistent with a fall against rocks. Dr. Haw's initial notes, written in pencil on the back of a pharmacy receipt and later copied into his private diary, said something different. They said the bruise on the temple was too clean, too localized to have come from tumbling among river stones. They said the fingernails of the right hand were broken and packed with fibers that looked like wool, dark wool, the color of a man's coat. They said the clothing, when removed at the undertaker's shed, showed tearing at the collar and waist that had not come from water. They said on the inner wrists, there were marks that could have been made by the pressure of a strong hand, and a line across the throat, faint but present, that could have been made by the edge of a forearm held there too long. And they said something else in a line Dr. Haw later underlined 3 times. For no more than 6 hours, they said, the body had been in the water, which meant on the night of the 13th Abigail Morse had not gone into the river when she had finished her shift, but sometime after midnight. After 5 hours she could not be accounted for. 5 hours when she was somewhere in that town with someone alive. Word of a drowned mill girl moves through a mill town the way smoke moves through dry pine. By 9:00 in the morning, the looms in the number 2 weaving room had gone silent because Mercy Morse had been sent home, and the girls who worked beside her had followed. By 10, the news had reached the machinist's shop, and Michael Thibodeau had fallen to his knees on the floor and had to be carried out by 2 of his countrymen, who laid him on a workbench in the back of the shop and spoke to him in French in low voices for nearly an hour, while he did not answer and did not weep and only stared at the ceiling, as if he were reading something written there that no one else could see. By noon, a crowd of perhaps 200 people, mostly women, mostly French and Irish, had gathered outside the undertaker's shed on Bridge Street, and the constable had posted a deputy at the door. By 1:00 in the afternoon in his carriage, Silas Bridgham had arrived at the shed, had spoken privately with Dr. Haw for 7 minutes, and had left. What was said between them was never recorded. For that afternoon, Dr. Hall's diary contains only 3 words written in a hand that the man's own son later said was not his father's ordinary writing. Those 3 words were, "He knows already." At this point, if you are finding this story as unsettling as we are, do us a small favor. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling us what you think happened to Abigail Morse, and share this video with someone who loves a mystery that refuses to rest. Your engagement is what keeps these forgotten cases from disappearing a second time. And now we continue. 6 days later, the first arrest came. His name was Patrick Gallagher. He was 28 years old, an Irish loom fixer who had worked in the South Mill for 11 years. And 3 weeks before Abigail Morse's death, he had been involved in a public argument with her outside the company store. At least 6 people had witnessed the argument, and its subject had been, according to every witness, Michael Thibodeau. In the blunt language of the weaving rooms, Patrick Gallagher had been sweet on Abigail Morse for more than a year, and had been displeased to learn from a cousin of hers that she was engaged to a French boy. 3 weeks before her death, on a Saturday afternoon, he had approached her outside the store when the street was full of people and had said something the witnesses remembered with varying clarity, but all agreed had been angry. Something about her being too good for a papist, something about her throwing herself away, something about her regretting it. And in front of everyone she had slapped him in the face, and he had walked away with his cheek red and his mouth working. 2 of the witnesses said, before he was out of earshot, he had turned back and called her a word they would not repeat under oath. One of them said he had simply stood for a long moment with his fists clenched and then had walked off without a word. No one had followed him. At the time, no one had reported the incident. In the life of a mill town in 1887, it had been an ordinary thing. On the afternoon of October 19th, at his boarding house on the canal, Constable Pellier arrested Patrick Gallagher and took him to the town jail. The charge was murder in the first degree. According to the constable's own account, Patrick Gallagher was drunk when he was arrested, though not violent, and he did not resist. Over and over he said only, as the constable led him down the stairs of the boarding house, that he had not done it, that he had been with friends on the night in question, that they would swear to it, and that he wanted a priest. A priest was sent for. The priest, a Father O'Brien, who had served the Irish parish for 6 years, spent an hour with Patrick Gallagher in the jail that evening and emerged, according to the deputy who was on duty, looking shaken but saying nothing. 4 weeks later, in the second-floor courtroom of the Oxford County Courthouse, 12 miles away in the county seat of Paris, Maine, the trial, such as it was, began. It lasted 3 days. 8 witnesses were called by the prosecution, 4 of whom testified to the argument outside the store. Dr. Hall was not called. His written report entered into evidence said only what his official log had said, that the deceased had been found face down in 2 feet of water, fully clothed except for her left shoe, with a bruise on the left temple consistent with a fall. The notes about the clean bruise, the torn clothing, the wool fibers under the fingernails, the marks on the wrists, the line on the throat, the 6 hours in the water were not in that report. Dr. Haw had written a second report, a clean one, sometime between October 15th and October 20th, and the second report was the one the court saw. The defense, paid for by a collection taken up among the Irish workers of the South Mill, called a single witness, a woman named Bridget Lassard, who ran a boarding house on the canal, and who swore under oath that in her common room Patrick Gallagher had been playing cards with 4 other men from 7 in the evening of October 13th until past 2000 in the morning of the 14th. The 4 other men were called. The 4 other men confirmed They named the game they had played, which was euchre. They named the stakes, which were pennies. They named the brand of whiskey they had been drinking, which was a local corn whiskey distilled by a Scotsman named Mallister in the next town over. The details were consistent. The witnesses did not contradict each other. For 90 minutes, the jury deliberated. On all counts, Patrick Gallagher was acquitted and walked out of the courthouse into a cold November rain. And the Irish of Peaton Falls did not celebrate because they understood without needing to speak it that the question of who had actually killed Abigail Morse had not been asked and would not be asked, and that their man had been the easiest man to accuse, that the ease of it was itself a warning. What Dr. Ephraim Haw did in the days between October 15th and October 20th, when he rewrote the coroner's report, is the first of the three silences at the heart of this story. Folded into his diary, which was preserved by his granddaughter and donated to the Maine Historical Society in 1947, where they sat uncatalogued until a graduate student found them in 1981. The original pencil notes survived. Why he rewrote the report, the notes do not say. They say only in an entry dated October 17th that at his house he had received a visit from a man he called only S.B., who had stayed for 1 hour, and that after the visit he had walked down to the river alone and stood on the bridge for a long time, and that when he came home he had not eaten his supper. For October 18th, there is no entry. The entry for October 19th, the day of Patrick Gallagher's arrest, says in full, "I am not the man I was a week ago. God forgive me." The handwriting in that entry is the tight, cramped handwriting of a man writing with a shaking hand. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was hard in Peaton Falls, as winters in western Maine are hard. In the shallows, the river froze. Against the north walls of the mills, snow drifted up and had to be shoveled by boys with scoops every morning before the shift. The price of coal rose. Between Christmas and February, a diphtheria outbreak in the French part of town killed 14 children. In layers of clothing, the women worked in the weaving rooms and wet their lips against chapping, and did not speak of Abigail Morse, because the overseers had made it clear that speaking of Abigail Morse was a thing that could get a woman's hours cut. Mercy Morse kept her position. She did not miss a day. Each evening she came home and sat with her mother at the small table in their kitchen, and in silence they ate their supper. And neither of them asked the question that was sitting at the table with them, because neither of them had the answer, and because asking would have made not having the answer harder to bear. In February of 1888, the second arrest came. His name was Jonas Chadwick. He was 42 years old, the overseer of the number 2 weaving room, which meant for the last 6 years of her life, he had been Abigail Morse's direct supervisor. He was a Cornish immigrant, unmarried, and lived alone in a cottage on the mill's property. Among the women in the weaving room, he was known as a strict but not cruel overseer, a man who kept his distance, who did not joke, who did not drink, who attended the Methodist chapel on Sunday mornings and was not otherwise seen socially by anyone. Along the canal path, the new evidence claimed he had been seen walking with Abigail Morse on 3 separate evenings in the 2 months before her death, at hours when the weaving rooms had long since closed. The evidence was presented by a 14-year-old Doffer boy named Samuel Hodkins, who came forward in late January and swore to the constable that he had seen what he had seen. The boy was specific. He named the dates. He described the clothing. He said, on the second of the 3 occasions Abigail Morse had been crying, and that Jonas Chadwick had been walking close beside her, speaking to her in a low voice, and that when they had passed the boy, who was standing in the shadow of a warehouse, on an errand for his father, Abigail had wiped her face with the back of her hand and had not seen him. The constable took the statement. A warrant was issued. At dawn on the morning of February 9th, Jonas Chadwick was arrested at his cottage. 3 weeks later, the trial began. On the second day of the trial, Samuel Hodgins did not appear. A deputy sent to his parents' boarding house returned with the news that the boy was gone, that his family said he had left for an uncle's farm in New Hampshire, and that they did not know when he would return and would not be able to produce him. For a delay, the prosecution asked. The judge, a man named Willoughby Payne, who had been on the bench for 19 years and who was known to keep a very tight docket, denied it. When the prosecution called its other witnesses, 2 women from the weaving room, who had heard Samuel Hodgins say what he had seen, but who could not themselves testify to seeing it, the defense objected hearsay. Sustained, the judge ruled. The prosecution had nothing else. The defense, paid for by no collection, but by a retainer that the court records did not trace, called Jonas Chadwick to the stand. And in a flat, exhausted voice, Jonas Chadwick denied every accusation. And for less than an hour the jury deliberated and returned a verdict of not guilty. Out of the courthouse Jonas Chadwick walked, returned to Piton Falls, packed his belongings into a single trunk, and left on the evening train to Portland. He did not resign his position at the mill. The following week his position at the mill was quietly filled, and his name was not mentioned in the company records again, except in a single line in the payroll book that read, "Settlement paid 60 a point." Samuel Hodgins, the Doffer boy, was never seen in Piton Falls again. His parents stayed. His mother continued to work in the weaving rooms. The uncle in New Hampshire was never named, and in any genealogical record that has since been searched, no such uncle appears. The parents, questioned years later by a reporter from the Luan Evening Journal, refused to speak of their son. The mother is said to have wept. The father is said to have stood up, walked to the door of his parlor, opened it, and waited in silence until the reporter left. Among the many questions this case leaves us with, what happened to Samuel Hodgins, perhaps the one that has most troubled the small number of historians who have looked at it. The uncle does not exist. The farm does not exist. In no cemetery in Oxford County is the boy buried, nor in any cemetery in Coos County, New Hampshire. From the federal census after 1880, his name disappears. As far as the written record is concerned, he is a boy who said a thing and then ceased to be. Just when we thought we had seen the worst of this town's silences, the story turns again, and it turns in a direction that will force us to ask whether in that cold spring of 1888, anyone in Piton Falls was still telling the truth about anything. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and subscribe if you have not yet, because what comes next is what broke the town apart. Let us discover together what happened in the third trial. In August of 1888, the third arrest came. Its announcement was met in Piton Falls with something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but resembled, in the accounts of the few who wrote about it, a long exhalation of held breath. The accused was Ezra Bridgham, the son of the mill owner, 24 years old, heir to the White House on the Hill. Against him, the evidence had come finally from Dr. Ephraim Haw in the last week of July. Dr. Haw, now 58 years old and visibly ill with what his son would later identify as the beginning of the stomach cancer that would kill him the following spring, had walked into the office of the county district attorney in Paris, Maine, carrying a leather satchel, and on the district attorney's desk had placed his original pencil notes from October 14th, a copy of his diary, and a signed affidavit. The affidavit ran to 4 pages in his own cramped hand, and it laid out with the methodical precision of a man who had been rehearsing the words for a long time exactly what he said had happened. It said under pressure from Silas Bridgham, he had falsified the coroner's report in October, that the pressure had taken the form of a conversation in his parlor on the afternoon of October 17th, during which Silas Bridgham had reminded him, without ever raising his voice, of the 420 debt owed by his late brother to the Bridgham Mill Company, and had mentioned, now without ever explicitly threatening, that the debt could be either forgiven in full or called in full, and that it had occurred to him that the doctor might find it easier to write a simpler report than the one he had originally drafted, a report more in keeping with what the community would find comforting in a tragic accident. The affidavit said in writing by Silas Brigham's own hand, the debt had been forgiven on November 1st, 1887. The affidavit said the bruise on Abigail Morse's temple had been inflicted before her immersion in the river and was consistent with a blow from a man's fist, that the torn clothing and the wool fibers under her fingernails indicated she had fought her attacker, that the marks on the wrists and the throat indicated restraint and suffocation, and that she had, in the doctor's medical judgment, been strangled to unconsciousness before being placed in the water, where she had drowned while still breathing, but unable to resist. And it said finally that from what he had heard in the undertaker's shed on the afternoon of October 14th, he had reason to believe that the attacker had been Ezra Bridgham, because Silas Bridgham, when he had arrived at the shed that afternoon and had been shown the body, had not asked any of the questions a man who did not already know the answers would have asked. The district attorney was a man named Hiram Crocker, a Republican from the southern part of the county, who owed nothing to the Bridgham family, and who, according to his own later memoir, read the affidavit twice, and then sat at his desk for a long time with his eyes closed, and then he issued the warrant. At his father's house on the evening of August 3rd, Ezra Bridgham was arrested, taken to the county jail in Paris, and held without bail. The news, when it reached Peaton Falls on the morning of August 4th, traveled through the mill in less than 20 minutes. The looms stopped. The women did not cheer. They did not weep. They stood at their machines, according to one of the 3 surviving letters Mercy Morse wrote to her cousin in Luon, and they looked at each other, and they said nothing at all. And after a long moment they started the looms again, because the overseers were shouting, and the mill did not stop for the dead. On September 11th, 1888, the trial of Ezra Bridgham began. It was by every measure the most closely watched criminal proceeding in the history of Oxford County to that date. Reporters came from Portland, from Luon, from Augusta, and from as far as Boston. The courtroom seated 112 people and held on the first day closer to 200, with the overflow standing against the back wall and filling the stairwell. The air in the room by mid-morning was thick enough that one reporter wrote of having to loosen his collar to breathe, and the windows were kept open even as the September air outside grew cold, so that the voices of the lawyers and witnesses had to carry over the rustle of papers and the scrape of chairs and the occasional shout of a newsboy on the street below. Personally by Hiram Crocker, the prosecution was conducted. The defense was conducted by a 3-man team from Boston, led by a criminal lawyer named Everett Pike, who had defended railroad companies, bank officers, and 2 congressmen, and who had never in a career of 26 years lost a murder trial. No expense had been spared by Silas Bridgham. The cost of the defense, according to a letter Silas Brigham's accountant wrote to an insurance underwriter the following year, was $7,200, which was more than Dr. Hall had earned as coroner in his entire career. On 4 pillars, the prosecution's case rested. First, the revised coroner's testimony, now given under oath by Dr. Haw from the witness stand with the original pencil notes entered into evidence. Second, the testimony of a housemaid at the Bridgham residence, a 19-year-old girl named Sarah Daring, who swore that on the night of October 13th, at some hour past 2 in the morning, Ezra Bridgham had returned home with mud on his boots and a scratch on his right cheek, and that she had heard him from her small room off the kitchen, washing his hands in the scullery, for what she estimated to be nearly half an hour, and that the next morning, with instructions to clean it with particular care, she had been asked to take a certain coat to the town press, and that the coat had been damp, and that it had smelled faintly but unmistakably of river. Third, the testimony of a night watchman at the South Mill, a man named Owen Mackey, who swore that at approximately 8:30 on the evening of October 13th, walking along the canal path in the direction of the Morse house with a coat collar turned up against the cold, he had seen Ezra Bridgham, and that at approximately 1 in the morning, walking back in the opposite direction, alone, moving quickly, no longer wearing the coat, he had seen the same man. Fourth, the testimony of Michael Tobito, Abigail's fiancé, who swore that 2 weeks before her death, Abigail had told him that in the weaving room corridor Ezra Bridgham had approached her and had made, in her words, an offer she had refused, and had then said to her, in a voice she remembered as quiet and unbothered, that she would regret the refusal. Michael Tobito further testified that even though it would cost them the money they were saving, Abigail had told him she intended to leave the mill before the wedding, because in that corridor, she did not feel safe anymore, and that he had asked her why she had not told her mother or her sister, and that with a small sad smile he remembered vividly, she had said that some things a girl kept to herself in that town if she wanted to keep her job. Over the 3 weeks of the trial, every one of the 4 pillars was pulled down. Under cross-examination by Everett Pike, Dr. Haw was questioned for 11 hours across 2 days. To dispute the pencil notes was not Pike's strategy. He attempted and succeeded in establishing that for 11 months Dr. Haw had lied under oath and in writing, had accepted what amounted to a bribe from Silas Bridgham, had falsified a public document, and was now dying of cancer and afraid for his soul, offering a testimony that could not be verified by any other living person, and that was by Pike's careful construction of the record. Equally consistent with a desire to injure the Bridgham family, for reasons the doctor himself could not quite name. Throughout, Pike was polite. He did not raise his voice. He referred to the doctor as sir. He asked at one point, with a tone of almost gentle concern, whether it was not possible that a man in Dr. Haw's condition near the end of his life, and carrying a weight of guilt that no man should have to carry alone, might not be shaping his memories to fit the shape of the confession he felt he needed to make. At that point, Dr. Haw had been on the stand for 6 hours and did not answer for a long time. When he answered, he said only, "I am telling the truth." Pike nodded and said, "I am sure you believe you are." With great politeness across the remainder of the cross-examination, Pike suggested the jury was being asked to convict a young man of murder on the sworn word of a self-confessed perjurer. By the end of his testimony, Dr. Haw was grave-faced and trembling. He left the stand and did not return to the courtroom. On the evening train, he returned to Peaton Falls, went home to his empty house, and began that night to write his will. Sarah Daring, the housemaid, was questioned for 2 hours on the morning of September 20th. She confirmed her prior statement. She described the mud, the scratch, the washing of the hands, the coat. She was then asked by Everett Pike whether it was not true that from the Bridgham household, she had been dismissed in July of 1888, 3 weeks before coming forward with her testimony, for the theft of a silver spoon. She admitted that it was true. She was asked whether she had not been overheard in the company store on the day of her dismissal to swear that she would, in her words, see the son of a Hardau hang if it took her the rest of her life. She denied it. 3 witnesses were produced who swore they had heard her say it. The jury watched her face redden and her hands shake. And when Pike released her from the stand, weeping, she left the courtroom and was not called again. On the day he was scheduled to testify, Owen Mackey, the night watchman, did not appear. A deputy sent to his tenement found the door locked and the rooms empty. Questioned the following morning, his wife said only that on the night train to Boston her husband had left, and that he had not told her why, that he had left her with $38 in cash, and that she did not expect him to return. Owen Mackey was never found. To the Boston police, his disappearance was reported. No body was recovered. No sighting was confirmed, and in the house her husband had not been. On September 24th, Michael Thibodeau, the fiancé, took the stand. He was 21 years old. In 11 months, he had not slept properly. He spoke in English that was clear but slow, and in a voice that the Portland Reporter described as the voice of a man speaking across a great distance. He answered every question. He repeated what Abigail had told him. He described the conversation. He named Ezra Bridgham. He was asked by Hiram Crocker whether he had any doubt that Abigail had told him the truth. He said he had none. And then on cross-examination, a single question was asked by Everett Pike. Pike asked him whether in the week following Abigail Morse's death, he had been overheard in a saloon on the canal to swear in the hearing of at least 4 men that with his own hands he would kill Ezra Bridgham. For a long moment Michael Thibodeau said nothing. Then he said yes. Pike asked him whether a man who had publicly sworn to murder the defendant could be trusted to tell the truth about words the defendant had allegedly spoken to a dead girl 11 months before. Michael Thibodeau did not answer. Pike thanked him and sat down. The prosecution attempted a redirect. Hiram Crocker asked whether the grief of a man whose fiancé had been murdered might not reasonably produce a moment of drunken anger that did not reflect his ordinary character. Michael Thibodeau said yes, but the damage was done and the jury had seen what Pike had wanted them to see, which was a man who wanted Ezra Bridgham dead badly enough to have said so in public. After all this, the defense called only 3 witnesses. A Boston physician who testified that, in his professional opinion, the injuries Dr. Hall had described could have been caused by the mechanical action of a body in a river over a period of hours. A Peton Falls minister who testified to Ezra Bridgham's excellent character. And Silas Bridgham himself, who on the morning of September 30th took the stand, and for 45 minutes without ever raising his voice spoke about his son, about his mill, about his town, about the tragic death of a young woman whom he had known by sight, and for whose family he had the deepest sympathy. Near the end of his testimony, on speaking of his own late wife and of the children they had raised together, he wept once briefly. The Boston Reporter observed that in his entire time covering the courts, he had rarely seen a more effective witness. For 6 hours on the evening of October 2nd, 1888, the jury deliberated. At 10:15 that night, they returned with a verdict of not guilty on all counts. In the front row of the courtroom, Ezra Bridgham embraced his father. Silas Bridgham was seen to weep openly, which was, according to 3 separate correspondents, the first public display of emotion anyone present had ever seen from him. By private carriage that same night, the Bridgham family left Paris, Maine. They returned to Peton Falls. The following Monday, the mill reopened. In January of 1889, Ezra Brigham was promoted to assistant superintendent. In 1891, he married the daughter of a Portland shipping family. He had 4 children. Until 1946, he lived and was in his later years a trustee of the Maine Historical Society and a donor to several worthy causes, including the restoration of a small Congregationalist temple in his hometown, which by the time of his death had been closed for 2 decades and stood empty on a hillside above the silted canal. On March 17, 1889, 5 months after the verdict, Dr. Ephraim Haw died of stomach cancer on his deathbed. According to the son who was with him at the end, over and over he said only the same phrase in a voice that was barely a whisper. The phrase was, "They are all paid." What Dr. Hall meant by that phrase is the final question this story leaves us with, and it is the question that cannot be answered by any document, any testimony, or any honest reading of the evidence, because the answer requires us to believe a thing that no court in 1888 could have found, and no court since has been willing to find. When you lay the 3 trials side by side, the pattern does not look like justice failing. It looks like a machine working exactly as it was designed to work. In the first trial, the witnesses who alibied Patrick Gallagher were all residents of a boarding house owned by a man who held a mortgage from the Brigham Mill Company, and the mortgage, according to the county recorder's office, was forgiven in full in the spring of 1888, 6 months after the trial. In the second trial, the boy Samuel Hodgkins, whose testimony would have convicted Jonas Chadwick, disappeared to an uncle who does not exist in any census, and his parents, who did not leave Peton Falls, were moved within 6 months of the trial from a double room on the canal into a small but clean rented house on Maple Street, the rent on which, according to the landlord's surviving ledger, was paid in cash each month by a party the ledger identified only as P.F. Mill Company. The 38 could have been savings. The hanging could have been a suicide. And this is the precise point at which the pattern hides itself, because under close examination, each separate suspicious fact dissolves into the ordinary texture of life in a mill town in 1888, where the mill owned the mortgages, the houses, the jobs, the newspapers, the selectmen who appointed the coroner, the sheriff who chose which warrants to serve, and in ways that were never quite written down, the consciences of the men who held all those offices. The pattern is only visible when you step back from the separate facts and look at them together. And even then, what you see is not a conspiracy in the modern sense, not a meeting of men in a locked room, but something older and quieter, and in its way more terrible. You see a town, an entire town, tacitly agreeing that a certain answer could not be arrived at because the answer would require the town to dismantle itself. And so instead, 3 different men were tried and 3 different acquittals were obtained. And each acquittal, because it was honestly won in a court of law by a jury that had reasonable doubt, closed a door that could not afterward be reopened. By the time the 3rd door closed, under any remaining legal theory, it was no longer possible to accuse anyone else. Double jeopardy had attached. The principle of finality which the law holds sacred had sealed each verdict shut. The case was not solved. It was completed. A difference exists between the 2 words, and the difference is the distance between a confession and a burial. And that perhaps is what Dr. Hall meant when with his last breath he said that they were all paid. He did not mean only the jurors, although the jurors may have been. He did not mean only the witnesses who disappeared or died, although those payments are the most traceable. Something larger, I think, he meant. He meant the entire machinery of a town that had for a generation accepted the bargain of the mill, the bargain that said you may have wages and houses and schools and a church and a certain kind of decent life, And in exchange, you will not ask when a mill girl is pulled from the river with wool fibers under her fingernails, who it was she fought before she died. He meant that the payment was not only in money. The payment was in silence, and the silence had been accepted, and by the autumn of 1888, the acceptance had become indistinguishable from the town itself. A town is a thing that agrees over time on what it will not see. Piton Falls had made that agreement, and the agreement had held, and a girl was in the ground, and the wheels of the looms kept turning, and the water kept falling over the dam, and the great pale hands of Silas Brigham had folded themselves at last over a job well done. On October 16, 1887, in the Yankee Cemetery at the north edge of Piton Falls, Abigail Morse was buried. Her stone is small white marble and reads only her name, her dates, and the words taken early. Another 19 years her mother Hannah lived and never remarried and never spoke of the case in her remaining letters, of which 7 survive. In one of those letters written in 1893 to her sister in Luan, only once in passing she mentions her younger daughter, referring to her as my Abigail, who is not here. And to anyone who reads it now, the phrase has the quality of a door that has been closed so gently and for so long that it has fused with a wall. For the rest of her life, her sister Mercy worked in the mill. In 1894, she married a grocer's assistant, had 3 children, and died in 1931. Her children, interviewed in the 1970s, said in all the years they had known her, their mother had spoken of her sister perhaps 4 times, and always in the same phrase: that Abigail had been the prettier one, and that she had deserved better, and that there were people in that town who knew what had happened and had chosen not to say. The children had not asked her what she meant. They had been afraid to. One of them, the eldest, said in the interview that she regretted that now, but that at the time it had seemed cruel to ask, and that her mother had worn her silence the way some women wore widow's weeds, and that at such a garment you did not pull. Ezra Brigham was not killed by Michael Tibito. 1 week after the verdict, he left Piton Falls, moved to Woonsocket, Rhode Island, took a job in a cotton mill there, and according to a great-nephew who was traced in the 1970s, never again spoke the name Abigail aloud, though he kept in a small wooden box on his dresser until the day he died in 1938, a tintype photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a direct, unsmiling gaze. He never married. At his written request, in the left breast pocket of his burial suit, the photograph was buried with him. The great-nephew, who was a boy of 11 when Michael Tibito died, remembered only that his great-uncle had been a quiet man who made him wooden toys in a small workshop behind the boarding house where he lived, and that once the boy having asked why the old man lived alone, Michael Tibito had stopped his planing and had looked at him for a long moment and had said only in a voice the boy never forgot, "Because I was not there," and he had gone back to his work. Piton Falls itself did not survive the century. As the cotton industry moved south, chasing lower wages and longer hours and workers who did not yet know how to organize, the mills began to close in the 1890s. The last mill closed in 1921. The population fell. The White House on the hill was sold subdivided and eventually torn down in 1954 to make way for a highway interchange that was never built. The company store became a hardware store, then a pharmacy, then a vacancy. The canal silted in. By the 1970s, the town had fewer than 800 residents and was unincorporated. On most maps today, it is not. Drivers who pass through on the county road see a few empty brick shells along the river, a boarded-up church, a small cemetery with Yankee names, and move on without knowing that they have crossed the ground where a girl was killed in the autumn of 1887 and where for 11 months a town performed upon itself the elaborate ritual of proving that no one at all was responsible. the Morse file. The full file, with the 3 trial transcripts, and the diaries and the letters, and the payroll ledgers and the Portland inquest, and the Brigham accountant's correspondence, and Hannah Morse's 7 letters and Dr. Hall's pencil notes and the small surviving fragments of the boarding house mortgage was assembled for the first time in 2003 by a local historian named Margaret Esther Fallon, who published her findings in a small academic journal called the New England Review of Labor History, on who died in an accident on a dry road on a clear afternoon 3 weeks after the article on a clear and 3 weeks after the article appeared. The driver of the other car was not identified. The journal remains available. The file remains available. The answer it points to is not strictly speaking an answer. It is a shape. It is the shape of a town closing around a killing the way a fist closes around a coin and keeping the coin, and passing eventually out of history with the coin still inside. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most terrifying thing in a story is not a single monster, but an entire community that has decided, and without ever holding a vote, that some truths will cost too much to speak. Abigail Morse did not drown. 3 men were accused and 3 men went free, not because the law failed, but because the law worked precisely as powerful men had arranged for it to work. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the 3rd man was the killer? Or is there a 4th possibility we have not yet considered? Do you think at the end Dr. Hall told the whole truth, or only as much of it as he could bear to say? Was Margaret Esther Fallon's accident truly an accident? Or did the long arm of a dead mill town reach out one last time to close a hand it had been holding shut for more than a century? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten crimes pulled from the archives of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that refuse to stay buried. The dead do not rest when the living refuse to remember them.